Welcome to On Listening. Today's guest is Andrew Heartman in California. He's been practicing as a surrogate partner and intimacy coach for 11 years, and he is co-founder of the Surrogate Partner Collective. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Fantastic. I've recently seen some trainings that Andrew does, and I read a lot of his emails that go out on a listserv that I'm on. And I got really curious about how a person who listens in the conditions of intimacy coaching conceptualizes listening. What kinds of listening does he do? What does he think listening is? And I'm grateful, but he agreed to appear with me. Is there anything you want to start with, or should we just start talking about listening?
Well, actually, before we talk about listening, why don't I give a little more of the context for what you were talking about? You just said that you were curious how someone who teaches and practices intimacy skills in my profession conceptualizes listening. And so I'd like to give a little bit of an overview. In my role as a surrogate partner, I participate in this modality called surrogate partner therapy. Now, surrogate partner therapy is for people who need help with some aspect of the way they relate to other people. It could be socially, it could be sexually, it could be in the context of intimate relationship. And the purpose of surrogate partner therapy is to create an environment that is both supportive as well as realistic to help that person develop these skills. In this context, they're working with both a surrogate partner who actually does hands-on experiential exercises with them. And in so doing, a temporary relationship is formed between the surrogate partner and the client. Meanwhile, the client is also seeing a verbal therapist or clinician of some kind. So they're getting both real-life experiences as well as they have a support structure to help them process, understand, and integrate those experiences. So while they are with me, we are doing exercises around touch and communication and body image, and listening is an important part of this structure that we are creating, because listening, I believe, is one of the essential components to help someone feel safe, and therefore to help someone feel more able to take the risks that they haven't been able to take in other contexts.
I love it. That's a very succinct and clear definition, which I agree is going to be really helpful to the audience.
So then from that background, we can get into listening. And in my work as a surrogate partner, one of the things that makes this modality so unique and so powerful is that I can teach intimacy skills by example. I can teach by modeling. Everything that I ask a client to do, I will be willing to do myself. Once I have demonstrated that, then the client is more likely to be able to take a risk themselves and to try it and see how it works and to see the results. You know, so many times in our relationship, we'll say, well, I'm willing to be vulnerable, but you go first. And in this context, I can go first. And that opens the door in a lot of cases.
I like it. I mean, I know I like the particular kind of, I don't know if you call it a treatment, but the kind of relationship and skills that and experience you help people develop and learn to develop.
Thank you.
To go back to your first comment about listening. So you in the listening environment, you're trying to create a sense of safety.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the things you do that you find help people feel safe?
Well, a big thing is people feel safe whenever they feel seen and accepted. And the way that listening plays into this is that listening is a way that people actually feel like they're being received. Like they're being received not only at their words, but also their feelings and who they are as a person. When I'm listening not only for the words that someone will say, but I'm listening for the tone with which they express it. I'm paying attention to body language and gestures. And I'm also paying attention to the experience that I'm having in my body as I receive that communication. I think that this ties into intimacy because I believe, like I define intimacy as the capacity to sustain our experience of self while remaining open to be affected by another.
That's a fantastic definition. And in particular, I like the part where you're asking people to maintain a sense of self. I have talked about and read material that attempts to be empathic with another person, quote unquote, walk on their shoes, can lead to the other person getting a little too distant from their sense of their self. They're too much in the other person's experience. So you describe intimacy as having a dual function of moving towards, but also maintaining yourself.
Yeah, it's kind of like myself as the thermometer or myself as the instrument that is resonating with the communication. Now, if I'm too focused on the other person that I lose touch with myself and my own experience in it, then I don't think that's true intimacy. Or if I'm exclusively focused on myself so that I lose the connection with the other person, then that's not true intimacy either. But if you think about it, it's not like a water faucet, right? A water faucet is, in terms of temperature of the water, is one spectrum. You can go the whole way to hot on one side, or you can go the whole way to cold on the other side. But when you're in the middle, you're not really hot or cold. You're, warm or lukewarm or cold.
Right.
And if we viewed this dual awareness that way, like either I have my attention on you or my attention on me, or if it's somewhere in the middle, then it's 50% on you and 50% on me. But I actually don't view it that way. I believe these are separate, independent scales. I can have none of my attention on you and none of my attention on my own internal experience. Or I can have 80% of my attention on you and also 80% of my attention on my own internal experience, because they are independent. And can we cultivate a dual awareness where having my attention on you doesn't cut into the awareness that I have on myself and vice versa? Can I cultivate the ability to be completely in touch with two different things at the same time? Like, can you have your attention on your right hand and your left hand at the same time? And I believe that it is possible to have complete attention on someone else and what they're saying and what they're communicating, as well as complete attention on my own experience of it as I allow myself to be impacted by the communication.
I love that dichotomy to, rather than merge things and get a lukewarm, both in the figurative and the literal sense, a lukewarm kind of approach to see if you could turn both dials up and recognize. It would be interesting to have like a neuroscientist sort of help figure out, are you actually fluctuating really quickly between those two, or are you really having some kind of maintenance? And so I was thinking about that a little as you were talking, trying to find an example where I think that it's my hunch that there's that more than one thing in the mind is going on at a really high level at the same time. And I thought of like someone playing in an orchestra. They are listening to their instrument. They're listening to goodness knows how many other instruments. They're watching the music and the conductor's there. And to think of it as fluctuating back and forth, like it just happens too fast almost, at least that's my imagination, that it's like more like being part of a symphony. So I'm appreciating that quality. I hadn't thought of it that way, that our sense of self is independent from how much we keep our focus on the other person's experience. And it was more than just the sense of self. It was the attention to a particular, the centering sense of ourself, not just like we could have an internal awareness that's not about our centered sense of self. It could be about an itch on my right ear that I'm focused on, but I'm not really keeping to the boundary of who am I as I'm talking to you. I'm just juggling a third thing. So that's cool. Well, I like that.
And also the impact of what's being communicated on me and on my experience, right? Because part of what we want to cultivate is the ability to be impacted by someone else, because that's the way that they feel seen and accepted and received. Yeah. I love the analogy you gave of the orchestra and a musician playing in an orchestra, because I think that that's apropos. And in preparation for this podcast, I was researching this concept of multitasking. And there are some people who say that we don't really multitask. Instead, our brain just switches back and forth between two or more different tasks so quickly that we don't realize it's happening. But whether or not we are multitasking on a neurobiological level, I don't know how relevant that is, because regardless of what happens in the biology, it's still my own subjective experience that I do have this dual simultaneous awareness, both of self and other.
Yeah. So you're helping me map out kind of a image of listening. There's our kind of consciousness, and my consciousness is attending to what's happening inside of me and my sense of self, and my consciousness is attending to everything related to you. And so I'm listening to two different things at the same time. And and that's how I conceptualize listening. And then when you talked about intimacy, I think what you described as intimacy is a lot what is commonly called interpersonal empathic listening, where there's a sharing of the emotionality and a sharing of the experience and a sort of a sense of feeling that you're really with the other person and the other person feeling that they're really with you. And listening is defined less as listening to and more listening with, and that the intimate listening is a creation that is really between people and with them, sort of merged in a way.
Mm-hmm. So I want to look at some things that interfere with that.
Good.
I thought of an example. And I was doing this other interview once where the interviewer referred to me as a sex surrogate. Now, you probably know from my emails that I do not like to be called a sex surrogate. I think it's really misleading, and I'll explain a little more about that in a moment. But what happened was the minute they used those words, I stopped listening.
Right.
Instead, I went into reaction and I started to think about my response, about how I was going to respond to this and how I was going to diplomatically correct them and explain why we don't like that phrase. So that's something that interferes. If is my own reactivity, then I stop listening, and instead I was had shifted into a point that I wanted to make in response. Well, I prefer to be called a surrogate partner, and occasionally this phrase "sex surrogate" still comes about. That was commonly a phrase that was commonly used in the 70s and 80s. But I really think it's misleading because it distorts the nature of the work and what it is that we do. And I'll give an example to illustrate this. Suppose you had a professional chef who was trained and experienced at preparing a wide variety of appetizers and entrees, but also spent about 10% of their time making pastries. It would be really misleading to call this person a pastry chef, right? Because you're taking something that's a minor part of their work, and you're putting it in the title.
Yeah.
And it would be similarly misleading to call me a sex surrogate, because you're taking something that is, again, a very minor part of the work that we do, and you're putting it in the title in such a way that it's out of context. And that can create misleading impressions in the clients who could benefit from this kind of work, in the therapists that we work with, and in the general public. Because we always do work in collaboration with a therapist or verbal clinician. And so it's really important for that to be involved, and therefore that we have therapists and clinicians that have an understanding of the modality and their role in it, which is one of the reasons I developed the course that you mentioned, which is called Collaborating with Surrogate Partners in the Triadic Model. The triadic model refers to the fact that there are three of us, and so there are ways to collaborate effectively to support the effectiveness of this modality.
What I think I hear is that it's important to you to be clear about how you're trying to define or redefine a profession and skill set that's been around much longer than you've been involved in it, but kind of keep it current. And it's almost harder to re-educate than to educate in some way. So you got a little uphill battle if you're trying to, if McDonald's just, Facebook goes to Meta. Well, I don't hear the word Meta going around very much. So it's much harder to rebrand, I think. And
right. When I was a software engineer, I could tell people that was my employment, and they had a sense of what I did. But if I tell someone I'm a surrogate partner, then either they have no idea, or if they think they know what it means, it's pretty likely that the ideas that they have are incorrect. And so then I end up having to educate them and to help them understand what it is truly about.
Yeah.
But if we bring this back to listening, like I was using this as an example of a time when I was communicating with someone and my own reactivity prevented me from listening.
All right. I've been toying with an idea. And the idea is that, well, personal admission, I'm pretty allergic to the idea if I did it wrong, or at least being told I did it wrong, or that you're supposed to follow this pathway. And obviously, there's my own neurosis behind that. But I do think there's something about, so you were doing your best to listen, a thing happened, and then you refer to yourself as stopping listening. Either listening is the pinnacle of performance, or something was happening in the listening that needed to get clarified and addressed and fixed. So maybe I'll go back to the orchestra, since you joined me in that analogy. If in the orchestra someone gets off key, does that mean that the orchestra's not playing, or that the process of listening and tuning into oneself and tuning one's instrument is actually going the way it's supposed to, and it just didn't sound as good at that moment, but really the process of intimately playing together is still going on? So you're doing your thing, and you might disclose, hey, I think I didn't capture a lot of what you were saying because I was having a reaction. Let's explore that and go further. To take it a little further, not listening would be to not utilize any tools to make it sound better again, to recalibrate. Because it's inevitable. Everybody's going to, you could be in the middle of a conversation and, everybody is going to get distracted in some way. I like to think of it as they just were listening to a different stimulus, right? So I think that you're listening in yourself, you were listening to something that made it hard to have a lot of salience for what the other person was doing. But if listening happens between people, then it might have a flow state, but it might have some more jagged and challenging components where the analogies, the music doesn't sound as good, but we're still in the process of listening to each other and recalibrating. I'm curious about your reflections on that.
I would agree. I don't think there's anything wrong with stopping listening. And I'm actually really proud of myself that I had the awareness to be able to communicate what was going on for me.
Yes.
And at that time, my focus just shifted.
Right.
But when I said stop listening, I didn't hear a word that was said after that.
Yeah. You did right. Right. Yes. I do know what you mean by that. I know what you mean. I guess we could call that stop listening. But you came back. You didn't exit the conversation. You didn't get so distraught you couldn't function anymore.
Right. And I was able to explain why I disagreed with that particular title, so that I could come back to listening, so that I could resolve the internal conflict I was feeling, the reactivity that I was feeling, and then get back to, being able to receive once we had that understanding.
I don't know, maybe I'll be stubborn and say, one could say that you really listened very carefully to that person and picked up on all the references that are involved in using the term sex surrogate, and then had to think, and then paid great tribute and respect and honored the other person by helping them to know where you're coming from. But I'll try to hear stopped listening not as a problem and more like a temporary cognitive overload for a moment. Because it's quite an accusation. The problem is it's like weaponized, I think. You're not listening. Well, I'm not listening because I came home and there was chocolate milk all over the carpet. It was hard to listen to what you were saying the moment I saw that.
Yeah, it would definitely be different if you're viewing it as a problem.
Right.
In fact, there's a teacher a relationship teacher named Allison Armstrong. And she talks about how sometimes we listen from the perspective of what's the problem, or what's the point. And she claims that when you're listening from that perspective, you're kind of listening with an agenda. And you might even be jumping ahead of what's being communicated to try to get to the answer that you're looking for. And so in that way, you're not really listening to what the person is saying on the way there.
Yeah. Did you feel that I did that with you?
No.
Oh, it's nice to have I just want to say, as the sort of host of the podcast, it's lovely to interview an educator who has a tremendous ability to help the conversation flow and move. And I notice that and appreciate that, bringing us to important things. I'm curious, one of the things I try to do in the show is be a little recursive to try to reflect on what's happening as we're talking about it, right? You said that you get to model vulnerability, for example. So as an intimacy coach, someone who's listening, do you have any reflections on this conversation? Anything to highlight about what you notice about the listening and our communicating?
When you're talking about Facebook and how it's changed to Meta, you said that word doesn't come up very often. However, I think it's coming up right now because a meta conversation is a conversation about a conversation.
Yes, taking
that's true. A step up and looking at having a conversation about what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And so this is precisely what we're doing.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's also something that I want to incorporate in my work, right? Because the intention is for the client not just to have experiences, but for them to be able to take the skills and learning that they're having and apply it to other relationships. So that means throughout the process, I'm asking them not just what it was like to have a particular experience, but how did that experience impact the relationship? I might ask, do you feel closer to me or further away? And either way is okay, but it's more valuable to know how things impact the relationship than it is to just do a certain activity. Because it's really valuable to know how to consciously and deliberately create intimacy, right? What builds closeness? What has us feel connected? Because once you know that, then you can employ that with other people. And so I believe that the way that we've been interacting has been supportive of connection. Even in the way that we are each not wanting to interrupt the other person or not wanting to talk over the other person, even with a slight delay on the line.
Good. I like that reflection. Do you have another thing to teach about listening? Another idea? I love that you were kind of studying up a little bit before we talked. Do you have another thing you want to contribute?
Yeah, I do.
Good.
And it's related to barriers to listening. Mm-hmm. And so far, we've talked about two of them. We talked about how an agenda can interfere with listening.
Yes.
We also talked about how internal dialogue can interfere with listening. But there's another one, which is how comfortable I am with feeling. Right? Because when someone's communicating, they're communicating not only words and concepts, but it's possible that they might also be communicating feeling. And if I'm comfortable with my own feelings, then I will be able to stay present with someone else who's feeling emotion. But if I'm not comfortable with the expression of anger or sadness or something like that, then I may consciously or unconsciously attempt to minimize the feelings that they are expressing. And that's a barrier to this type of empathic listening that we are talking about.
I completely agree.
So my question is, as I'm listening, can I fully receive not only their words, but the feelings behind it, even the very essence with which they are communicating? Can I receive that? I think it's a really valuable relationship skill. If someone is expressing anger or sadness, those emotions that we often call negative, can I receive that without defending, without, having a barrier to that because of my own discomfort?
I think you named what people call the quote unquote negative emotions, which I think fear also people put into that.
Mm.
I agree that if either party or more, if there's a larger group, if any party has resistance to having their own feelings, that can manifest as tuning the other person out, changing the subject, defensive, attacking, withdrawing, or just simply not completely missing something. And I think that people do want to feel that they want the affective experience of feeling heard. You're gonna have a feeling that lets you know that Dan Rosen's listening to you. Not you're not going to ask at the end of the show. So could you say back to me everything that I said? No, you're going to know because there's a affective quality to it, and some might even say that's one of the most important things. But I think I agree, and getting overwhelmed is definitely an obstacle. We're not having fluidity. I imagine as a coach, then, you're helping people identify their agendas, their emotional blocks, their other things that interfere in that kind of communication. And then they're working with the therapist. I doubt you're sort of instructive, like, go back to your therapist and figure out how to feel that feeling. But some kind of becomes involved in the treatment plan, I'm imagining, or to be addressed to increase facility with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, oftentimes people in general, as well as the clients I worked with, are uncomfortable with anger, for example. Yeah. And I give an example of one of my classes about how I had a client who sent an email to me in between sessions. And whenever we met the next time, she said, well, I was afraid you would get really annoyed that I sent this email.
Yeah.
So she's expressing a fear that I would get annoyed.
Yeah.
And so, think about what I could do in that moment. One response would be to say, oh, don't worry, I wasn't annoyed.
Right.
And that is true because I wasn't.
She'll make sure that you're annoyed at some point if she wants. Like if she has to get that addressed, that will get communicated.
Well, exactly. It's going to happen. It's going to happen because feelings arise in relationship, and there's always misunderstandings and there's always rupture. And I hope that there is some kind of rupture in the relationship with clients, because that's the only way that they can experience having rupture and then repairing it and recovering from it and coming back to connection. And that's a tremendously valuable relationship skill. So anytime there are two or more people in any kind of relationship, there's going to be conflict. There's going to be emotion. And in coming back to the example that I just gave, I could have taken the route of reassurance and saying, oh, don't worry, I'm not annoyed, because I wasn't. But I also thought that this was an opportunity to look at our relationship with anger and to do it in a way where there's not a lot of emotional charge. And so I asked her, well, what if I was annoyed? What would that be like for you? Would that be okay? And is there room in our relationship for me to be annoyed? Because, as you've said, annoyance is going to be part of any relationship. And we have to be able to tolerate the other person expressing authentic emotion.
Yeah.
And so I sometimes work with these emotions, even in the hypothetical, right? This annoyance wasn't present at the moment, but we were able to explore it just by imagining it was and exploring that in a way that's safer and more comfortable than if I had actually been annoyed at that moment.
Yeah.
Right? It's an entry step into this concept that can be dealt with in a way that's safer. And so hopefully, whenever we do get to a situation where genuine anger arises, we already have enough of a foundation with exploring it that it can be accepted and received.
Lovely. That's wonderful. I'm hearing very similar notes to psychotherapy as you talk about how you work with people, and you get to have a different kind of relationship with people that is has a more real quality. Well, not that therapy relationships aren't real, but there's almost, you emphasize that we construct a short-term relationship for a particular purpose of practicing, learning, experiencing, overcoming fear of relationship, and that has unique opportunities.
I believe that there are two main things that create intimacy, and those things are vulnerability and touch. And a lot of the exercises that we do around communication, around body image, around touch, even around sexual education and eroticism, arousal, a lot of those things are very useful because they give us an opportunity to experiment with vulnerability. They give us an opportunity to explore vulnerability, to be vulnerable, which involves taking a risk, right? If it's not vulnerable if it doesn't involve a risk.
That's right.
If it doesn't feel like it's a risk, then it's not vulnerability, it's just authenticity. I think those are the difference between them. If being authentic is a risk, then it's vulnerable.
I like that.
A lot of the topics we talk about are useful because they are vulnerable, right? It's often vulnerable for people to explore their relationship with their body and their body image. It's vulnerable to talk about sex. And it's vulnerable to talk about insecurities and fears and to feel our emotions. Because anyone who was raised in a dysfunctional or an imperfect family, has learned to some degree, don't talk, don't feel, don't
That's
trust.
Right. It's so true.
And so, at least that's what the literature of recovery says. And so we want to be able to have opportunities to talk, feel, and trust in an environment where that's safe enough to take that risk and for that to be okay and for us to do it and see the results. And eventually we get to a point where we realize that vulnerability is not only okay, but it's an important part of building intimacy, and it's essential to have the relationships that we want.
I think you're on solid ground with that. I hear that in a lot of other, I mean, not to sound judgmental, but I completely agree. I hear the same thing from other people exploring emotions, that vulnerability is really important, but we have to find a way to safely do that. We have a couple more minutes, and there was one aspect that I wanted to get to that, and if you're able to answer, it'll have to be brief. You talked about touch. I think you said intimacy, the two ingredients, touch. Was it intimacy? Two ingredients are touch and
vulnerability.
Yeah. So touch can touch be a kind of listening?
Absolutely.
Tell me a little more about that non-auditory listening.
One of the reasons why touch is so important in this context is because there's a direct form of nervous system to nervous system communication called co-regulation. And in fact, children do not have the ability to regulate their own emotions and their own experience when they're very young. Instead, they learn self-regulation by learning to co-regulate, which means interacting with someone else whose nervous system is better regulated. And ideally, this takes place with a primary caregiver who is attentive, attuned, and responsive.
Mm-hmm.
However, a lot of us didn't have primary caregivers who were sensitive, attuned, and responsive. Or to some extent, it's a spectrum, right? We may have someone who was that way most of the time, but some of the times they weren't. Or we might have a parent who's not that way at all, or only 10 or 20% of the time. But the good news is that this type of co-regulation can be experienced and learned anytime throughout the life cycle, even as adults. And the way it shows up is that there is when one person who is experiencing a lot of anxiousness or reactivity comes into contact with another nervous system that's not anxious, whose body is more settled, then there can be a direct transfer of information from one nervous system to another. And that can help that other nervous system become more settled, to become less reactive, to become more relaxed, and to ultimately start to feel more safe in their situation. Mm. So many times, especially if we've had past trauma, we start to notice evidence that we're not safe. Mm-hmm. We are constantly scanning unconsciously for evidence that we're not safe. And oftentimes our bodies will even respond before we have a conscious awareness that this is happening. But what I try to invite clients to do is to look for evidence that they are safe. Mm-hmm. And this is really groundbreaking for a lot of people because they've never even considered that problem. And because it's not natural, we get tuned toward a certain negativity bias. Because it's not natural, we have to do this consciously at the beginning. But like anything else, when we do it consciously, we can eventually start to have it be done more automatically as we integrate that awareness into our body and in our nervous system.
I love it. I'm imagining that the use of touch can help co-regulate, that you can help your clients through the mechanism of co-regulation. In psychotherapy, it's if one person's triggered, I think is the common phrase now, then it's sort of, there's things we could do verbally, but there's nothing like some kind of physiological connection to help somebody else settle their nervous system, and not just rely on their own stabilization.
Psychotherapists can definitely co-regulate, even sitting across from someone in a room, but there is a way that it can be more direct in the presence of actual physical contact.
Yeah, I'll breathe with people and maintain eye contact and pace, which I imagine that's some of the kind of distant co-regulation, but it's quite a tool you have to shift somebody quickly. In a world where there's so much disconnection, the idea of an intimacy coach, a partner to not feel alone, a partner to help soothe, to reparent, to overcome the overwhelming feelings that get in the way of connecting with a loved one or other people in your life. It's a beautiful idea that, as so many social institutions that foster connection have lower turnout or are inhibited by COVID. It's a lovely idea to, you get real general. It would be nice to have an intimacy coach at every corner.
I have found an uptick in the interest that I've been receiving as a surrogate partner, because after 2 years, plus or minus, of isolation and lockdown and quarantine and all this, I think people are really seeing the value of connection and of intimacy, and they're seeing that the ways that they're missing that in their lives.
Absolutely. Andrew, it was a pleasure to interview you and to learn. We are out of time, but I appreciate so much your formulating your thoughts, getting to the bullet points and really fleshing them out for us. It's very, really nice. I can't thank you enough. I'd come over there. Of course, I'd give you a hug. So,
well, that would be welcome.
Good.
Maybe we'll have an opportunity to do that sometime. Okay, I'd like to give my website, which is surrogatepartner.us. And I'd also like to give the website where I host my courses, which is surrogatepartnercollective.org. And there are 2 courses intended for clinicians and surrogate partners about how to work effectively in this modality. The first one, as I mentioned, is called Collaborating with Surrogate Partners in the Triadic Model. And the second one is called How to Help Generalize Surrogate Partner Therapy. And generalizing is the process of helping someone take the specific experiences they're having with this one specific person and to apply it to other relationships, to their future relationships, into their life outside of therapy. And there are actually concrete interventions that can be taken both by surrogate partners and by collaborating clinicians to support this process. And I'm so passionate about this being so very important for surrogate partner therapy that I've really organized and presented this information as a way to help people know that that is really the intention. That is really the essence of this work that we call surrogate partner therapy.
Thank you so much, and we'll continue the dialogue another time.